All right, so the problem is, it seems like there are two gods. By the way, did anybody notice the gods I was putting up on this is Janus, the two-faced god? No, nobody, right? It was funny, but nobody cares. All right. That, of course, is not Janus. It's the, what do you call that thing? The two masks thing? Yeah, the comedy tragedy thing. It's like for thespians, right? All right, so the problem is it seems like there are two gods. Why is it that God and Jesus seem to be so very different? Over the next 4 weeks, we meaning Greg and I, are going to make a sustained argument that we think it's metaphor. Which is to say, the Bible uses metaphor, and because we don't understand metaphor, we tend to get our ideas of God wrong, and sometimes very wrong. And this comes from somewhere. And I know I've talked about this before, but this time we're actually talking specifically about this topic. This is an important issue, whatever you're talking about in the Bible, because the Bible uses metaphor throughout. Metaphor is theology, right? And so you're constantly talking about metaphor, but now we're actually focusing on metaphor and how metaphor works and what it does to our understanding. Why this is a huge issue is that there are basically historically two interpretive models for understanding the Bible. One of them, I don't want to say this yet. Well, let's say it this way. There's two sort of parts of our history, right? Before Christ and after Christ. If you can't see what this picture is, this is from Laodicea. This is a pillar, and on the pillar is a menorah. Do you see the menorah? And out of the menorah is springing a cross, right? This very well sort of explains the nature of our relationship, the relationship of these two faiths, which is, originally, they weren't two faiths. When Christ was on earth, Christianity was Judaism. When Paul was on earth, Christianity was Judaism. In the first century, there weren't two faiths. That happened later on. And as that started to happen more and more, people who were more like the Greeks were taking over, and unfortunately, people who were more like the Greeks and less like our Jewish forefathers thought about the world differently, and that's why we have these two streams, and so these two interpretive streams. And so I want to recommend one of them over the other. One is this. This is us. This is how we see the Bible largely. If you don't know what that picture represents, then you haven't read my thesis, and no, that's all right. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. This is basically a pictorial explanation of what's going on in the mind when the mind is conceiving of a metonymy. A metonymy is when you use something to talk about another thing within the same domain. So these balls, these circles, are domains. A domain is something that we form. You start to form it very, very, very early in life, basically right at birth. One of the first domains that you start to form is self. You start to understand yourself as a self. You start to form the domain body, right? And so suck your thumb, that's part of your body, because you touch it, you can feel it, right? Nose, part of the body. You start to form this concept, this frame, these are also called frames, the frame of body. And over time you start to form new frames or new conceptual domains. Mama, right? Family, friends, house, dog, right? So the way that these things are formed, if any of you have ever done any work with Gestalt theory, the idea of Gestalt theory is that we see things as wholes because we've experienced them over and over and over again. And once you see them as wholes, then you sort of break them down into their parts. But the first thing that happens is that you understand it as a whole. Just for example, if I think I've used this example before, if a dog were coming down the road, you wouldn't say, "Hey, that's a dog tail. Hey, that's a dog paw. Hey, that's a dog nose. That must be a dog," right? No, you see the dog first, and then you see the parts. We tend to see things in wholes, as whole experiences, and we learn to do that through experience, right? So we have a domain called driving or riding in a car, right? Because since we were little kids, we were tooling around in, little baby seats and whatnot, and looking out the window and having the experience of having to pee and nobody's going to stop the car and you're really, really mad. These kids nowadays, they have the experience of like watching movies, which was never an option for me. But all right, so what a metonymy is using one part of one domain to point to something else in that same domain, or to point to the domain as a whole. This morning I got behind the wheel and drove to church. When I say I got behind the wheel, you know that I mean I got into my car, right? And so I'm using the word wheel, which is part of the whole, to tell you about the whole. And your mind did that automatically because you have this gestalt-formed frame of driving, right? So I got behind the wheel, you don't even think about it. You know I got into a car. That's how metonymies work. You stay inside one category. You stay inside one frame. You stay inside one domain. The reason that we think this way is we are heirs of Platonic philosophy. And I just brought up Aristotle here because he's just a good example. He actually wrote a book on categories. And basically what he's doing in that book on categories is saying, this is one domain, this is another domain, this is another domain, and let's keep those things separate. Let's think well about things, let's categorize things appropriately. And great work. Brilliant guy, and I'm all for categories. This is not me bashing Aristotle. The problem, though, is that they always wanted to do that. They did that as a regimen of separating things that are unlike. The other major interpretive strategy for the Bible and basically for life is this. That is not a metonymy. It is what? That's right, it's a metaphor. So this is happening in my mind when I am thinking about a metaphor. I am taking one domain and I am mapping it onto a completely other domain. Right, so I'm not staying inside one domain anymore. I'm now talking about one thing in terms of another. And so the Bible does this an awful lot. There are a lot of metaphors that show up in the Bible. The problem is that ain't us. We're not heirs in the biblical study sense of our Jewish forebears. We're more heirs of the early church fathers, almost all of whom were Greek. All of whom were saturated in Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy. And so, over time, we came to be biased against this model of thinking, this model of seeing the world. And unfortunately, that model, that metaphorical model, is the model that the entire Bible is written in. That's why it's so hard to read. If you've ever read the Bible and felt like you were stupid, you're not stupid. And, no offense, but even if you are, you're not as dumb as people in the first century. Most of them wouldn't have been educated, right? Most of them would not have known how to read. These are not super brilliant people, right? In general, there were brilliant people, obviously, but I'm just saying, the scriptures were written for the common class in a way that common people could understand what was being written. We don't understand it. The issue isn't that we're not smart enough. The issue is that we think differently than they did. We use different models, and it makes it much harder to read. Like, imagine reading a book in a language that you don't read. That would be super hard, right? It's because our minds work differently. Yes, so why does that matter? I just explained it to you. All right, so, but ultimately it matters because, and this is the big difference. This is the big difference between thinking metonymically and thinking metaphorically. It completely changes the topic you're talking about, right? Because in one model, you're staying inside one domain. In the other model, you're moving outside that domain to something completely different. And so if you interpret something that's a metaphor as a metonymy, you're going to get the topic of what you're talking about absolutely completely wrong. And sometimes backwards, as I will now show you. All right, so this is... it's a convention of conceptual metaphor theory that when you have a conceptual metaphor or conceptual metonymy, really anything at the conceptual level, it's in small caps. But PowerPoint doesn't do small caps, so they're big caps. So if anybody's watching this, no, I didn't get it wrong. Anyway, nobody ever watches these. I don't think my mom even watches these. All right, so yeah, so we commonly use this conceptual metaphor. By the way, a conceptual metaphor is a metaphor before you speak it, right? Because it has to be in your mind before it comes out of your mouth. Best case scenario. And so we all have this conceptual architecture where we've mapped two very different things, right? Love and war. But to prove to you that you have actually mapped those two things, mapped means that you've made comparisons or analogies between them. He's known for his many conquests. We're clearly not talking about me, but you understand the idea of love conquest, right? Whatever. All right, so, but like we know, when I say that, you know that I'm not talking about, like, he's not a conquistador, right? He's a playa, right? So, he's slowly gaining ground with her. All right, we're not talking about a war gaining ground. We're saying that he's winning over his love interest or whatever. Like, this is all good stuff, right? But we're using the language of war to explain good stuff. She fought for him, but his mistress won out. Ooh. But nobody actually fought, although they might at the end of that. He overpowered her or overcame her, whatever, inhibitions or whatnot. She's besieged by suitors. By the way, these are all quotes from maybe the most important book in conceptual metaphor theory called Metaphors We Live By. So I'm just quoting George Lakoff. So if you yourself don't use these phrases, you probably use something like them, though, right? Have you seen phrases like this before? Words like this, language like this before? He has to fend off all the people who are in love with him. Also not me. Saying he's trying to win a woman over. That's love is war. He's trying to make an ally of her father, so her father will say good things, and then she'll date him. You get it, right? This is all using war language to explain what love is like, right? He's not talking about an actual war. He's talking about one thing in terms of another, and those two things are completely different. Here's the thing, though, is that we use war as a metaphor for other things, like the opposite of love. By the way, conceptual metaphors are written this way: X is Y, and conceptual metonymies are written this way: Y for X. So if you're wondering why that looks like that, that's why. He is known for his many conquests or fights. Like, he's a fighter, but this time we're not being metaphorical. He's slowly gaining ground against her, because now he's not fighting for her; he's fighting against her. She fought him, but he and his friends won out. He overpowered her. So it's very similar language. But now we're starting to read this differently because we understand what? In the first instance, that he loves the girl. In the second instance, that he hates her guts for some reason. She's besieged by enemies, and he has to fight people off because people hate him. And now maybe he's trying to turn her father against her or something. I don't know. But so the difference between love is war and war for hatred is love and war are very different things. They occupy different domains. War for hatred is in the same domain. It's in the same master domain because people who are at war with each other do tend to hate each other, right? And people who hate each other not infrequently end up in war. What this does is, and this is the reason I'm telling you this, when you're reading something and you don't know if it's a metaphor or metonymy, if you were reading one of these sentences, which are fairly close to each other, if you were reading one of these sentences and you didn't know how the guy felt about the girl, you wouldn't know whether to interpret this metaphorically or metonymically, which means you don't know if he loves her or if he hates her. Love and hate aren't just different, they're opposite. And so if you don't know whether you're supposed to be using metaphor or metonymy, you're not going to just get it wrong, you're going to get it completely backwards. This is the fundamental issue that we have with reading the Bible. We don't know how to read their metaphors, and it causes us not to just get information wrong, but actually backwards. All right. So how can we get better at this? We want to get better at reading metaphor, right? We want to get better at reading the Bible. So when we read it, it's like, oh yes, obviously, and not like, why did that just happen? Let's skip forward a few chapters, right? Let's practice by mapping out a metaphor. This occurs sometimes in the Bible, but don't think about biblical metaphors. Oh, you can if you want. I don't care. Love is a journey. So you have, I promise, you have this cognitive structure in your mind, because we all do. This is one of the most universal cognitive metaphors. And even if you very rarely use this language, you commonly think of love in terms of a journey. Can you think of any sayings that demonstrate that? How do you talk about love that uses the words or the categories of journeys? Growing. Yep. And so walking is actually an important biblical metaphor too. Yeah. What directs his way? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that the halakha, the word halak means to go in Hebrew. The halakha are basically the teachings, the laws of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is literally using the metaphor of walking. And I think one of the things it's thinking is walking with God, and that's a love metaphor. The whole Old Testament is based on this idea of walking with God, or God walking with us, which is a love metaphor. How about we've come a long way? Right? You ever say that to anybody? Yeah, you didn't go anywhere. I mean, maybe you went somewhere, but like you didn't start like here and end up here. You're not talking about like the distance you travel. You're not talking about hopping in a car, right? What you're saying is we spent a lot of time together. So in your mind, you've mapped the distance that people travel to the experiences that you've had together, right? Yeah, so sometimes walking is downhill and it's so easy, and then sometimes, yeah, you need a rope. Yeah, absolutely. Life has its ups and downs. What else? Yep. Not so much journey.
There are way stations. There are places where you rest.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, take a break kind of thing. Yeah, that's right. Because the walking is getting difficult. Anybody ever hit a rough road in the relationship? Nobody wants to put their hands up. Whatever. Liars. Rough road is using the love as a journey metaphor. Is that I love this person, but I just want to choke them right now. All right? Yeah, so we have in our minds, we've already mapped these two things, love and journey. And so it's easy. When I say we've had a rough road, you automatically know what I mean, right? I don't have to explain that to you. I don't have to define that more fully, because you've had the experience of having to walk uphill or walk across gravel with no shoes on or whatever else. I once walked across a hot top in the Dead Sea region. It was 120 degrees in the air. The hot top was considerably more than that, so I screamed the entire way. Because that helps. I don't know, screaming just gives you a sense that you're not going to die. I don't know. Anyway, all right, so that's essentially how metaphor works. Can you think of a new metaphor? Make a new metaphor based on the love is journey cognitive metaphor. What could you say that you haven't necessarily heard before, but we would probably understand what you mean?
Love is the way to go.
Yeah. Yep. I might have heard that one before, but yeah.
I didn't hear it. Love
It was the way to go. Yeah. I like that.
Jesus is the way.
Yeah. Yeah. How about this? Yeah. How about this? Oh, we've come a long way, but I should have taken the exit ramp. Right? Ooh, no! All right, so has anybody ever heard that before? But you knew what I meant instantly. The reason that you're able to comprehend that instantly is that those two domains are already mapped in your brain. And I know that they are, so when I say that, you get it instantly. That's what it was like for a 10th century BC Hebrew to read the scriptures. They were reading something, and they were like, I know what that is. That makes sense to me because those two things were already mapped. We don't have the same mappings that they did. And so we need to fix that. We need to have the mind of Christ to understand Christ, right? We need to have the mind of the Bible to understand the Bible. So how does metaphor solve the two gods problem? It changes what we're talking about from one thing to another thing. A lot of times it seems like the Bible's talking about one thing, but it's actually talking about something else. And if you've ever heard me teach on Revelation, this is my whole thesis. But I'm not going to look at Revelation except for one little passage. Yes, I have one little passage, but it's going to go by so fast you won't even notice. But all right, so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to look within 4 domains, right? 4 different domains that are important to the first century writers. And these are problem domains for us. These are ones that we don't understand very well. The one that we're going to do today is metaphors of state, which is to say God as king. Metaphors of prophecy. Prophecy is nearly 100% metaphor, which is a good thing, by the way. Metaphors are brilliant. Like, they get across an immense amount of information very, very quickly. When I said I should have taken the exit ramp, like, you had all these ideas, and I said, like, what, 4 or 5 words? And it created this whole scheme in your mind, right? And metaphors are able to do that because they create stories, and so prophets love to use metaphors. In War and Peace, see why that's funny? That's Dusty. All right. So I have to point out my jokes, and then they're not funny anymore. And then metaphors of love are generally of emotions, but ultimately of love. So those 4 things we're going to look at over the next 4 weeks. And we're going to see if it makes this guy look more like this guy. That's happy Jesus, and that's angry God. So don't listen to any of this. Yes, exactly. I thought, Easter eggs. See, they look like eggs. Anyway, I clearly was overthinking this presentation. Thumbs up. All right. So on to metaphors of states. What do we know about God? You will recognize this passage. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Right? Great passage. By the way, that passage is an allusion to something that happened in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 22. If you haven't read that chapter recently, go read it because it's important. All right, but if God so loves the world, then why stuff like this? From Genesis 6. I told you it's going to be a lot of Genesis in there. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart were only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Hurt is the word. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, good for Noah, but like everybody else seems to have a tough time with things. I know I use the same passages a lot, but really the Passover is super important for understanding New Testament theology. So I'm going to bring it up as often as possible. This is from the story of the Passover, from Exodus 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. The animals are like, what? What did we do? Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead, except for, of course, the Jewish houses, because they put the Passover blood on the door, and that's why they didn't die. All right. From Leviticus chapter 20, I cut out a couple sentences here just to make it shorter, but the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. All right. Frankly, I'm all right with that one. You shouldn't burn kids at this stage. The members of the community are to stone him. I will set my face against anyone who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute themselves by following them, and I will cut them off from their people. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I, the Lord your God, I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. There wouldn't be a whole lot of people still alive right now. Because they have cursed their father or mother, their blood will be on their own head. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. Remember that story from John chapter 8? They were going to stone the woman. That's based on Leviticus 20. If a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. That happens in 1 Corinthians. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, put to death when they have what they've done is perversion, their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, and of course he's thinking about a man, this passage is used in the discussions about homosexuality. Both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood is on their own heads. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wicked. Both he and they must be burned in the fire, so that no wickedness will be among you. I know that most of you don't read Leviticus. Yeah. The problem is that some of the most important passages in the Bible are in the book of Leviticus. But I wanted to hit the hard passages. I hit maybe the hardest chapter in Leviticus. You're welcome. From Ezekiel. By the way, the best parts of Ezekiel are as bad as the worst parts of Leviticus. If you don't believe me, read Ezekiel sometime. I picked a chapter at random. Except for the last 8 chapters, because they're happy. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You have been more unruly than the nations around you, he's talking to Israel, and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. You have not even conformed to the standards of the nations around you, these pagan, stinky nations. You're not even as good as they are. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations, because of all of your detestable idols. I will do to you what I have never done before and will never do again. Therefore, in your midst, parents will eat their children, and children will eat their parents. This is using language of besiegement, right? When a city is besieged, the whole point of besieging them is starving them into submission. In the ancient Near East, it happened. People would actually resort to cannibalism to stay alive rather than give up to their enemies. So that's what it's talking about. By the way, this idea shows up in Revelation. Huh? Yeah.
Which one's your favorite?
Yeah.
Which one's my
Yeah. Come here, let me lick you. That's weird. All right. I will inflict punishment on you and will scatter all your survivors to the winds. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your vile images and detestable practices, I myself will shave you. That's a slavery metaphor. I will not look on you with pity or spare you. A third of your people will die of the plague or perish by famine inside of you, right, because they're being besieged. A third of you will fall by sword outside of your walls once you open the walls, right, because you're not going to withstand the besiegement forever. So eventually you're going to open the doors and bad guys are going to come in and kill you with the sword. And then a third of you I will scatter to the winds and pursue with the drawn sword. Then my anger will cease and my wrath against them will subside and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath on them, Israel, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal. If God so loves the world, then why is he so dang mad? Right? All right, here's the thing. In the ancient Near East, gods were kings. Metaphorically, of course, because you didn't, pay taxes to Marduk. This is Marduk, a Mesopotamian king, Babylonian king. This is Horus, god, king god. This is Horus, an Egyptian king god. That's Baal, so that's a Canaanite king/god. And that is Asher, an Assyrian king/god. They are all kings, but they're all gods, but they all act like kings. And that means that they ruled. They did things with and for, and sometimes against, their own people based on how faithful their people were being towards them, right? And so you wanted to be faithful to the whoever the god king was in your area, because otherwise the king might have problems with you. And so when the early prophets wanted to explain why bad things were happening to Israel, and this is getting into the second domain, so I don't want to go too far down this road because I'm going to do it next week. But when the early prophets wanted to explain, next week is prophecy, wanted to explain why bad things were happening to Israel, they put those things in terms of divine retribution for unfaithfulness, because that was their experience, right? Metaphor is mapping one thing onto another, and in the best case scenario, it's mapping one thing that you understand very well onto something that you don't understand quite as well. And because you understand this, you now understand this, right? And so the prophets are trying to help Israel understand why bad things are happening, and there was a model for that in the 15th century BC, 10th century BC, 5th century BC, etc. There was a model for that. Bad things happened to you when you disobeyed the king, right? That was a common experience. And when good things were happening to Israel, those things were put in terms of his kingly or salvific faithfulness. I know I've mentioned this like 1,000 times before, but in the Bible, your Savior is your king. The role of king is as Savior. It's the king's job to save you, right? It's his one job. If somebody's attacking you, the guy whose job it is to make sure that person doesn't kill you is called your king. And before the kings, it was called your judge, right? But judges are also kings. Kings are also judges. So all of these metaphors sort of coalesce in the job of king, right? So when good things are happening, God is acting in his kingly capacity faithfully. Great movie. Too long, though. Can we agree on that? There should be a shorter version. All right, so the words God and Lord themselves are a metaphor. They're a metaphor. They're eliciting a specific experience that people in the 10th century, I'm just using 10th century because that's when David lived, people in the 10th century BC would automatically understand because they had a God who acted like a king. They had a king who looked over the people. And the God and Lord metaphors are metaphors for how Yahweh interacts with his people. That's what makes Israel his people, right? It's because he's their king. He's their God. If he wasn't their king, they wouldn't be his people. That's what makes Israel the people of God, is that God is their king. And then through them is how God interacts with the rest of the world. So God is king, ruler in Israel, but through being king in Israel, he relates to the rest of the world. Sidebar, this explains one of the hardships that the Israelites had in understanding the fate of the Gentiles. Because if God is the king of the Jews, how much should he have to do with these dumb, smelly Gentiles? Right? He's our king. He ain't your king. He's our king. They wanted God to be exclusive. They didn't really want him to rule the rest of the world. They wanted to maintain this special relationship with him, and I get that. Like, I love God too, but like, why not let other people into the kingdom? This was the issue in the first century church, right? How do we let these Gentiles in without breaking apart the church? The reason that was a hard issue is because they saw God as their king. Those Gentiles, they have their own kings. They have their own gods. Let them do their own thing. We got our thing. And then all of a sudden these Gentiles start coming into the synagogue. You're like, what? All right, so anyway, this is just a map of the ancient Near East. Some of the gods, God-king places. All right, so Marduk was here, and Asher obviously was in Assyria. That's Assyria's literally named for him. Baal was in Canaan. Egypt's not actually, mostly not in there, but he's down there. Horus and Ra and all of them are down there. All right, so this metaphor, this king metaphor, the state metaphor is a helpful way of explaining.
I blame you for the moonlit sky and the dream that died with the eagle's flight. I blame you for the moonlit nights when I wonder why are the seas still dry. Don't blame me.